Hello and welcome to the Intellect's Cove. My name is Colin Fairley. I'm the Sir Edward Peacock Professor of Political Theory at Queen's University, based in Canada. And in today's video, I'm going to unpack a few of the concepts and arguments that I deploy in Chapter 3 of my new book, Aging and the Ethics of Longevity Science. In Part 1, I covered the 4 stages of acceptance, where I argued that in time, resistance to the suggestion that rate control is an important aspiration for medical science would be abated. In this video, I'm going to cover what I refer to as Geroconservatism and briefly summarize the 5 challenges that wisdom inquiry longevity science must address to take seriously the challenges from Geroconservatism. Peter Medawar won the Nobel Prize for Medicine in the mid-20th century, and he argued that science was composed of 2 voices, what he referred to as the actual and the imaginative, right? So the voice of the actual is to focus on the things that already exist with respect to trying to treat and prevent specific diseases, and the imaginative voice is the things that may come into existence in the future. And Medawar argued that science involves an oscillation of both of these. You actually need both of these voices. We shouldn't dispense the actual, nor should we trivialize the importance of the imaginative. And in my book, I argued that these 2 voices today in the 21st century are represented by the war against disease, which is now the actual, although 100 years ago, it was the imaginative. And then the geroscience hypothesis, that is, the aspirations of translational gerontology, especially the aspiration to develop geroprotective drugs that hopefully increase health span and compress morbidity, frailty, and disability in late life. So both of these voices are important, and I'm going to, in this chapter, expand upon how the voice of the actual often is articulated as resistance or objections to the aspiration of translational gerontology. The philosopher Michael Oakeshott describes conservatism as a temperament or disposition, right? The conservative is somebody who prioritizes the familiar to the unknown, the tried to the untried, fact to mystery, the actual to the possible, the near to the distant, and the sufficient to the abundant. And this conservative temperament, which plays a very important role in politics, is also manifest in biomedical science. And in my book, I describe a position I refer to as geroconservatism as articulating Oakeshott's temperament of conservatism to biomedical science, and specifically to the aspirations of rate control. So with respect to the aspiration to harness experimental science to develop pharmacological interventions in aging, we should instead prefer the familiar to the unknown, the tried to the untried, fact to mystery, the actual to the possible, the near to the distant, the sufficient to the abundant with respect to human health and medical science. Right. So after studying the ethics of translational gerontology for 20 years, I could group most of the objections that commonly are raised as expressions of geroconservatism. So I start off with this umbrella term of geroconservatism, and I'm going to identify a number of more distinct expressions of this conservative disposition that is often raised as raising either concerns and or objections to the aspiration specifically of experimental science that aspires to develop drugs to target aging itself. In Beyond Humanity, Alan Buchanan makes a very useful distinction between a concern for human enhancement with an objection, which is a much more stringent claim. And there are definitely valid concerns for the development of geroprotective drugs, which I amplify throughout the book. But often many philosophers and bioethicists conflate concerns with objections. One way of abating the challenge from geroconservatism is to distinguish between the appropriate response to concerns about drug development for geroprotective drugs and objections. And I want to, I provide the example of what I call cautious Kelvin. So cautious Kelvin is a friend of mine, a hypothetical friend, who's going to be getting married in a few months. But he wants to look his best for his wedding, so he wants to lose some weight. He's worried about his mental health. He's been spending a lot of time just working indoors on his computer. And so he tells me that he'd like to go out running on a more regular basis. And I say, that's great. I love running almost every morning as well. So why don't we go out running together? And then Calvin starts to raise concerns that he interprets as an objection to starting a regular running regime. Right? So Calvin notes that actually last year, when he tried to get out running regularly, he ended up spraining his ankle and, had to use crutches for 2 or 3 weeks. And he's like, I don't want to, end up with another injury, so I don't think I'm going to start running again. And then he also points out, because we live in a very busy city with lots of cars, well, what would happen if he gets killed, right? The week before his wedding, he would never want to leave his bride, stuck in a situation like that. So Calvin is overly cautious, right? All he sees are the potential harms of starting a new exercise regime, such as injury and death. And injury and death are real potential harms of engaging in exercise, but they are offset by the potential benefits of engaging in physical exercise. So when cautious Calvin's mind fixates on the risk of injury and death, he articulates these as an objection to running, right? He shouldn't start running because he could sprain his ankle, maybe his knees will get inflamed, and maybe he'll get hit by a car and not able to get married, right? What a tragedy that would be. But Calvin is mistaken because he's conflating concerns about running with an objection to running. Right? A concern is simply a con, a reason against something. But it doesn't constitute an objection to running unless those concerns, those cons, outweigh any potential benefit. Right? So as Buchanan notes, all objections are concerns, but not all concerns are objections. And what we need to do, in my way of trying to convince Calvin to start running with me, is to weigh up all the potential benefits and the potential harms and the ways in which we could minimize those risks while never completely eliminating them, so that he sees running as a sage course of action rather than just continuing to stay home, working on his computer, gaining weight, and jeopardizing his mental health. So what I would suggest to Calvin, right, there's ways in which we can minimize the risk of harm. So we're going to start, before we start running, we're going to do a warm-up. We're going to run on a flat surface to minimize the likelihood of spraining his ankle. To avoid the traffic, maybe we'll run on the non-peak hours, like before rush hour, or we'll run on roads that are not as busy. We'll stay on the sidewalk. We won't wear music, right? With 2 of us running, we have 4 eyes to see the cars coming. So there's safety protocols that we can deploy to try to minimize, though of course I can't guarantee that Calvin will not suffer an injury or even death in going out and running. Like, living comes with the risk of mortality. But it's important that he recognize the benefits of starting his exercise regime, right? As he noted, he'd like to lose some weight. He'd like to improve his mental health. So when he's thinking about the impact running might have on his marriage, rather than seeing it as, well, he's risking dying before he gets married, he should see that actually he will improve the prospects of a long and healthy marriage by being in better shape than being overly cautious in a way that compromises his physical and mental health. Right? So cautious Calvin is overly cautious. What he really needs to do is weigh up the pros and cons and not conflate concerns with objections. And I want to suggest that many expressions of Geroconservatism are similar to cautious Calvin in that they overamplify the potential harms and trivialize the potential benefits of the development of geroprotective drugs. I identify in the book 5 sentiments of Geroconservatism. I'm just going to briefly mention them here, and I highlight the chapters where I explore them. The first sentiment is to say, well, developing drugs to treat cancer and Alzheimer's, that's morally laudable. But a drug to modulate aging is unnatural, right? Sometimes this is expressed, sometimes this concern comes from the belief that aging is programmed, that it actually serves some evolutionary purpose that's beneficial to the human species. Weismann articulated this view in the late 19th century. This theme emerges through chapters 6, 7, 8, and 12, and I deploy a number of points and arguments to undermine this first expression of geroconservatism. A second objection, this one invokes the conservative emphasis on the known versus the unknown. So there are known ways of increasing health span. Exercise, safe environments, a more equitable distribution of the social determinants of health. So this expression of geroconservatism typically will say, look, we don't need to prioritize drug development to target biological aging. We can already do this. And the idea that you would be emphasizing drug development is a kind of a moral hazard because it's trivializing the known ways that we can already do this. This theme is explored in chapters 6, 7, 8, and 12. It's definitely a valid concern, but it's not an objection. You actually want to pursue both of these things. But invoking the aspiration of drug development to target aging does not mean that we will not also need to pursue the known ways of non-pharmacologically intervening to increase the human health span. So both of these are important. Both the experimental arm of translational gerontology, represented by the development of drugs, and the known ways, the more traditional preventative health measures that we already know can help increase lifespan and delay the onset of disease, frailty, and disability. A third expression of geroconservatism comes from those that might argue, look, the gap between lifespan and health span is problematic, but the way to address it is simply to offer medical-assisted dying so that we're not exacerbating this gap any further. So the issue of a good death is the focus of chapter 10. Again, this particular objection, there is some validity to the concern about that a good death should factor into wisdom, inquiry, longevity science, but that does not mean that we should not also be pursuing the aspiration to increase health span while also trying to ensure that the population can experience a good death. And I argue that actually the aspirations of a good death overlap with the aspirations of rate control. A good death is much more likely to be jeopardized if we only pursue the aspirations of disease control, which will exacerbate the gap between health span and lifespan. The fourth articulation of geroconservatism typically comes in the form of some reservation about exacerbating inequality, and that is the focus of chapters 6 and 7. I think there's valid concerns, but not an objection to the development of geroprotective drugs. And if we approach translational gerontology in a responsible manner, I argue that actually geroprotective drugs can help us redress some of the persistent health span disparities that have persisted for many decades and are unlikely to be abated anytime soon because of the unequal exposure to the environmental stressors that accelerate biological aging. And the fifth and final expression of geroconservatism comes from those who worry that altering human aging will have some catastrophic impact on the environment and non-human animals. Again, I think there's valid concerns to be addressed, but this does not constitute an objection. And in the last two chapters of the book, I devote serious attention to the interdependence between human and planetary health and argue that actually promoting healthy longevity would confer many benefits on non-human species and planetary health more generally. So that is a bird's eye view of some of the themes from chapter 3 of the book, the 4 stages of acceptance, and then geroconservatism and the 5 distinct challenges that wisdom inquiry longevity science must address. In the next video, I will address chapter 4 of the book, Aging and the Ethics of Longevity Science.